I'm coming at you live on tape from Sydney, Ohio. And as you can see, my co host Snickers is here with me. And today we're talking the history of women's professional wrestling. Now, this is going to be a longer video, and it's not going to cover everything because I'd have to make like 4 or 5 videos to cover everything, and I don't feel like doing that because you guys aren't going to sit through 4 or 5 videos. So it's going to be a brief video. So it's going to be a brief history of women's professional wrestling. Now, women first started in professional wrestling in the 1800s, when professional wrestling was first getting started. And they were mainly sideshow acts of being strong men or egging the men in the audience on to throw them. And it was like that up until the 1920s, when wrestling became more theatrical. And then they looked for more beautiful women to put on more theatrical matches that wrestling had become. And we get soon probably the biggest women's star in professional wrestling, Mildred Burke. Born Mildred Bliss, her boyfriend at the time took her to a wrestling match, and she said, "This is what I want to do." So she found a trainer in Johnny Wolf, who did not want to train her, and told a man to body slam her, but then she body slammed the man. And so Johnny Wolf decided to train her, and later they got married. Mildred Burke was the biggest female star in wrestling history, frequently drawing crowds of 18,000. Now, you may say, well, that doesn't sound too big, but think about it this way. WWE nowadays draws crowds of about 18,000 for a television taping. So, and this was in the 30s and 40s and 50s. So, those were pretty good crowds, considering TV wasn't really prevalent till the 40s. She won the NWA Women's title and trained a lot of women and was in charge of booking the women in the NWA. She also started the World Women's Wrestling Association, where she held that title. But when she broke up with Johnny Wolf, after his many indiscretions with other women, they kind of ran her out of the wrestling business. So she went to Southern California and just trained women for the rest of her life. Now, Mae Young was also wrestling during this time and won multiple tag team championships and was another women's pioneer. Now we're getting into the Fabulous Moolah, who originally entered into wrestling as Slave Girl Moolah, Nature Boy Buddy Rogers' valet, and then got into wrestling and was named Fabulous Moolah by Vince Sr. of the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which later Vince McMahon Jr. took over and named the World Wrestling Federation. She was a jobber compared to Mildred Burke, but she finagled her way to the top and trained a lot of women, and also was in charge of booking the women for the NWA and later for the WWF. So she managed to hold on to power for a very long time, including having a record 28 women's championship runs, because she would lose it very briefly and then would gain it back. because, as I said, she booked the matches. Kind of like Jerry Lawler booked the matches in Memphis, hence why he held the Memphis title so many times. Now, she trained her women and told them to get power and get championships the same way she did it, through charm, charisma, and sex. And a lot of her women did not want to do that. They wanted their wrestling ability to get them on top. And so a lot of their women did not make it to the top. Now, in 1984, the WWF had the Rock and Wrestling Association and wanted to give the title to Wendy Richter, something Moolah didn't agree with, but she agreed to drop it. Now, I want to head back for a little bit and talk about, before we get into the rock and wrestling thing, I want to talk about the fact that during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and earlier, women's wrestling was actually banned in several states, including Ohio, Illinois, and New York. The reason being, the wrestling men would cause riots, and so these states thought it was unsafe for women. New York held its ban the longest, and several women and a promoter sued the state for women to get wrestling licenses. The final woman decided to get the media involved and made it a media circus. So one of the state representatives took up the cause, and finally New York unbanned women's wrestling. And in 1972, Fabulous Moolah was the first woman to wrestle in Madison Square Garden. Now let's go to the Rock and Wrestling Federation, Rock and Wrestling era, where Fabulous Moolah lost the title to Wendy Richter. Now at WrestleMania 2, Wendy Richter, not having signed a new contract, WWF wanted to take the title off her and gave it back to Moolah without telling Wendy Richter, and so Wendy Richter walked out. And WWF's women's division never quite recovered from that. They did, however, start a new women's division in the 90s with Medusa, who changed her name to Alundra Blaze, and even had one of Mildred Burke's students in there, Bertha Faye, which they didn't allow her to use any of her power moves because the men were using them. But that fizzled out when Alundra Blaze went back to being Medusa in WCW and threw the women's title in the trash. WCW tried to get a women's division going several times, but it just never was popular. In ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, they didn't have a women's title, but their women did stuff that no other women did up till that time, and they got extreme. They hit each other with weapons, they went through tables, they did stunts like no other women did stunts in wrestling up to that point. And Francine was known as the Queen of Extreme. Now, they also had cat fights and ripped each other's tops off, but they did extreme wrestling. Now, I'm going back to the 80s here for one of the first all-women's wrestling federations, Glow, who were really actresses putting on sketches and dramatic sketches and comedy sketches, but also wrestled, and it was very popular. Now, in the Attitude Era in WWF, the women were more sex pieces and actors than they were wrestlers. I mean, just look at Sable, just look at Sunny. I mean, they really weren't that great of wrestlers, but they were more known for their sex appeal. But later on, people like Trish Stratus and Lita and Jazz and Molly Holly proved that the women in WWF could wrestle, though they're still giving them shorter matches than the men. But after some of those women left, the term diva came to describe the women, and they were pretty much just sexy women with very short matches who couldn't wrestle. But in TNA, the women were proved just as vital as the men and just as popular. Their Knockouts division was very popular. The women proved just as good wrestlers as the men, just as popular as the men, and their match lengths were just as long as the men's. Later on, AJ Lee in WWF sent a tweet to Stephanie McMahon asking her why the women in WWE weren't giving longer matches. Stephanie, you could tell it kind of pissed her off, said pretty much fine, we'll give you a chance. And AJ Lee, I don't even remember who her opponent is, but I remember they blew the roof off the place. And since then, the women have been given longer matches. And then the 4 horsewomen from NXT came on the main roster and pretty much kicked the door down, doing stuff that up to that point only men did, such as Hell in a Cell matches, ladder matches, Money in the Bank matches, hardcore matches. Now, nowadays, many of the 4 horsewomen, well, only 2 of the 4 horsewomen remain, Charlotte Flair and Bayley. Well, Sasha Banks is Mercedes Moné on AEW, and Becky Lynch looks to be retired. But the women of WWE still get a lot of respect. While the Knockouts in TNA are still going just as strong as ever. But AEW, many of their women have broken down a lot of barriers, showing blood in matches, so things that WWE won't do, doing many hardcore matches that have become infamous, and putting on matches and doing a lot of main events. Now, in TNA, we saw our first women's world champion. Not a women's world champion, but a woman who was TNA world champion in Tessa Blanchard. And that was a first in America at that time. So that is pretty much the history of women's world wrestling up until that point. Very brief, but as I warned, it is a longer video. Tune in Wednesday, we're doing A Christmas Karen, which is a take on A Christmas Carol. And I have no idea what we're doing next week for the wrestling show. For me and Snickers here, that is good night.